Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I thought the worst thing about my wedding day would be my mascara running, maybe some cake landing on my dress, or Aunt Linda complaining about the gluten-free options at dinner. I was wrong, so incredibly wrong it's almost laughable now. But that laugh, let me tell you, it took years to earn. The moment that would burn itself into my brain didn't happen during the ceremony, or the reception, or even when Rachel threw her little tantrum in the dressing room. No. It happened when my own mother, the woman who birthed me, leaned in, curled her fingers around my arm like we were about to share a sweet family secret, and said, smiling like she was offering me cake, "We kept your graduation gift cards." Rachel needed them more. And you know what I did? I laughed. Not a big, theatrical, movie-style laugh. Just a small, quiet one. The kind that says, "I already knew who you were, Mom. But thank you for confirming it one last time on the most important day of my life." But let's back up a bit, because this story isn't really about the gift cards, not exactly. It's about how years of being the spare tire, the runner-up, the afterthought, finally got burned into ash. It's about how I walked down that aisle knowing I wasn't just marrying a man, I was burying a history, one stitched together with silence and second-place ribbons. The wedding dress was the first warning sign, if I'm being honest with myself. I had never dreamed of one. While other girls in high school were doodling lace sleeves and cathedral trains in their notebooks, I was watching my sister Rachel get all the attention. Prom queen, homecoming court, most likely to succeed. Every damn time. And with each celebration, each milestone, it was always Rachel first, Emily later. By the time it came for me to plan my wedding, I had already braced for what was coming. Still, I didn't expect my mother to hijack the dress appointment. I had chosen a small boutique, not cheap, but not outrageous either, run by a sweet older woman named Carla who'd been sewing dresses longer than I'd been alive. I booked it myself, paid the deposit, and told Mom I'd be going with my best friend Natalie. And of course, Rachel invited herself the night before. Or maybe Mom invited her. Who knows? They acted like it was the most natural thing in the world, like I'd be rude to exclude her from something so big. Rachel strutted into the boutique wearing 6-inch heels and a dress that could have passed for a bridesmaid audition. Carla barely got the words, "Let's start with a mermaid cut," out of her mouth before Rachel was pointing at racks, dismissing fabrics, grabbing champagne, and commenting on how some silhouettes just aren't flattering on broader hips. You know my hips. I remember standing there, in front of the mirror, wearing this stunning ivory gown with delicate beadwork and off-shoulder sleeves, feeling something strange and warm rising in my chest. Pride, maybe? Hope? It felt beautiful. It felt like me. I turned toward them, Mom and Rachel, expecting at least a nod, a polite smile, maybe even a "that's the one." But my mother frowned, a tiny purse of her lips, like she was trying to hide how disappointed she was. Rachel tilted her head. "I don't think it does you justice," she said, like she was doing me a favor. "We'll find you something better." That's when Mom chimed in, her voice soft and syrupy. "Honey, maybe we go with something simpler. You know, more classic. Rachel always says clean lines are best for you." Like I was a project they'd been working on together. I didn't buy that dress. I should have. But I didn't. I walked out with something simpler, less lace, more structure. It didn't feel like me, not really. It felt like them, stitched onto my skin. Then came the rehearsal dinner. And if you've ever walked into a room full of people who claim to love you and felt completely invisible, you know exactly what that night was like. My dad, Mark, gave a short speech that barely mentioned me. Rachel toasted Tom, my fiancé, as if he were a business partner she once mentored. Mom spent most of the night whispering with her sisters, occasionally glancing at me like she was waiting for me to trip and embarrass us all. Tom squeezed my hand under the table more than once. Each time he did, I caught a look in his eyes that said, "I see it. All of it. And I'm not going to let this happen again." It should have made me feel better. And maybe, in a way, it did. But it also made me angry. Because I was 29 years old, about to get married, and still needing someone else to validate that what I was experiencing wasn't normal. So when the morning of the wedding came and Rachel showed up late, with coffee for herself and a complaint about the lighting in the dressing room, I wasn't surprised. When she asked me to swap out one of my bridesmaids because Alyssa's hair is shinier than mine, and I'm in all the photos, I didn't even flinch. But when Mom walked up to me, just as the ceremony was about to start, and delivered that line about the gift cards, as if it were some beautiful memory instead of one of the most humiliating betrayals of my college years, something inside me finally fully cracked. Not the fragile kind of crack. The kind that lets the light in. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Tom and I had our own little secret. A deal we'd made months before. A plan that was simple, elegant, and about to change everything they thought they knew about me. And I couldn't wait to see the look on their faces when the envelope came out. The thing no one tells you about being the good child is that it's less about actually being good and more about learning to take whatever you're given and pretending it's enough. In my house, there wasn't space for two daughters to shine, and my sister Rachel had already claimed the spotlight before I was even old enough to know what that meant. She was 3 years older, louder, prettier in that obvious magazine cover way, and somehow always just more important, more delicate, more deserving of grace when she messed up, and more celebrated when she didn't. From the time we were little, my parents, especially my mom Susan, made sure Rachel got the top slice of every metaphorical pie. Whether it was school plays, sports, birthdays, or Christmas morning, she was the star, and I was the understudy waiting in the wings. If Rachel didn't want something, maybe it trickled down to me. Her clothes became my hand-me-downs. Her old hobbies became my opportunities. Her mistakes became lessons I was expected to learn from, quietly and without complaint. I used to think that was just how families worked. That some kids were born shiny and others were just there to clap from the sidelines. I remember being 10 years old and getting straight A's for the third report card in a row. I ran into the kitchen, beaming, holding up my paper like it was a trophy. Mom barely glanced at it before saying, "That's nice, honey, but Rachel's struggling with math, and we need to focus on helping her." Rachel, at the time, was getting CS, but you'd think she was battling brain cancer by the way they rallied around her. I still remember the burn in my chest, the weird ache of wanting someone to say, "You did great," without a qualifier or a comparison. But that never came. The unspoken rule in our house was this: Rachel needed. I endured. Rachel failed. I adapted. Rachel exploded. I cleaned up the mess. So, yeah, I got good at silence. And silence gets mistaken for strength, which is both ironic and sad, because all it really means is you learn how to swallow the things that hurt you. You become an expert at folding in your own needs until they don't even look like needs anymore. And when people ask if you're okay, you say you're fine because even if you screamed, you're not sure anyone would really hear you. But I did scream once. Not out loud, not in a way they could punish or shame. It happened after high school, when I got accepted to a college that none of them thought I could get into. I remember sitting in the admissions office of that little private university with a letter in my hand and this stunned feeling in my stomach like maybe the world was bigger than the cage I'd been raised in. That was the moment I started thinking maybe I didn't have to stay in my role forever. Of course, the moment didn't last. Because what happened next was the infamous gift card incident. Graduation had come and gone. My parents had gathered up all the congratulatory cards from relatives, coworkers, old church friends, and tucked them into a shoebox for safekeeping. They told me they were holding on to them until I got settled at school, that they didn't want me to lose track of anything. I believed them. Because I was still operating under the assumption that they, at some basic level, had my back. But a few months into my freshman year, I asked Mom if she could mail me the box. She hesitated, told me they'd already used some of the gift cards. Just a few, she said. Rachel had that car trouble, and, well, we didn't want her to go without. Rachel had totaled her car by texting while driving. Not her first accident. Not even her second. I don't remember what I said to my mom in that moment, but I remember what I didn't say. I didn't say, that money was mine. I didn't say, you're stealing from me. I didn't say, you're teaching me, again, that I come last. Because what was the point? Instead, I tucked it away like I did everything else. But eventually all those tucked away moments start to grow teeth. They gnaw at you in the middle of the night. They turn into conversations you rehearse in the shower. They wait. And on the morning of my wedding, all of them, every single moment I'd swallowed, started pushing their way to the surface. Because of course Rachel showed up late. Of course, she swept into the dressing room like she was the guest of honor instead of the maid of honor. She wore a robe that cost more than the photographer, brought a personal makeup artist she didn't tell anyone about, and carried an iced latte in her perfectly manicured hand. She didn't even say hello. Just looked around, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Is this the lighting we're using? It's kind of harsh on my skin tone." I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I knew what was coming. Then she turned to me, no warning, no shame, and said, "I need you to swap Alyssa out of the front row. She's prettier than me in group photos." I actually felt my soul step out of my body for a second. I looked at her, stunned, as if I hadn't known her my whole life. But I had. I knew her better than she knew herself, and I saw what this was. It wasn't about Alyssa. It wasn't about photos. It was about control. About reminding me that this day, my day, could still be hers if she wanted it to be. I looked over at Alyssa, who was sipping champagne and talking with another bridesmaid, completely unaware she was being sized up like a threat in Rachel's mental pageant. And then I made a decision. One that wasn't big or loud. Just solid. Just final. I told Rachel no. She blinked, as if the word didn't register at first. And when she tried to argue, I smiled, a smile so calm it scared even me, and said, "Not today." Because what Rachel didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the Emily they raised, the one who thanked them for leftovers, was gone. And the woman standing in front of that mirror, in a dress that didn't fit right but still belonged entirely to her, had a plan. A beautiful, brutal plan. And every second that passed brought us closer to it. There's a very specific look Rachel gets when things aren't going her way, a tight-lipped half-smile, jaw slightly clenched, shoulders perfectly still, like she's seconds away from snapping but won't do it until she's calculated the emotional fallout. I saw that look in full force less than 2 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, in a bridal suite filled with soft music, fresh peonies, and enough pastel silk to drown in. You'd think that kind of setting would make a person feel relaxed, calm, grateful even, but not Rachel. Never Rachel. She stood in the middle of the room, barefoot, holding the hem of her dusty rose dress in one hand and glaring at her reflection like it had personally betrayed her. The dress, the one she picked herself, after rejecting every other option I'd offered, apparently didn't snatch the waist enough or drape right over the hips. Never mind that it fit everyone else beautifully. Never mind that it had been altered twice at her request. It was, of course, my fault. "You did this on purpose," she said, not even pretending to mask her tone. I look terrible in this cut." I looked at her, mascara wand in hand, heart rate just below boiling. I could feel my bridesmaids behind me freeze. They knew better than to interrupt a Rachel rant. Even Alyssa, usually the outspoken one, quietly sipped her mimosa and stayed out of the blast radius. I blinked slowly, willing myself not to scream. "Rachel, you chose the dress." She turned to face me fully now, arms crossed, chin lifted like a queen preparing for war. "I picked it because you cornered me," she said. "You sent me that ridiculous spreadsheet with your approved tones and told me what styles would fit the theme. There was no room for discussion." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because if I didn't, I might cry. And I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction, not today. The spreadsheet had 12 dresses and 4 colors. I replied, calmly, evenly, as if we weren't having a full-blown standoff in front of half the bridal party. I let you rank them in order of preference. Rachel waved a hand dismissively, as if my logic were nothing more than white noise. Yeah, well, clearly I was sabotaged. And there it was, the classic Rachel move. The moment something didn't serve her ego, it became a conspiracy. A full-blown plot, orchestrated by the lesser people around her to keep her from being seen the way she thought she deserved. God forbid someone else be the star, not just for the day, but for even a moment. I opened my mouth to respond, but I didn't get the chance. "Emily," came my mother's voice, sharp and unmistakably irritated. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She was standing in the doorway, arms crossed in the same exact way Rachel had been seconds earlier, like it was a family pose they practiced in secret. She walked in slowly, eyes locked on me, not even glancing at Rachel, whose face was now morphing into a perfect mask of wounded innocence. "I'm not making anything harder," I said, but even I could hear the ice in my voice. "I just don't think being accused of sabotage in my bridal suite is the best way to kick off the morning." Mom gave me that tired look, the one she always used when Rachel had made a scene, and it was now my responsibility to clean it up. "You know your sister's sensitive," she said, as if Rachel were 5 and not a 32-year-old woman throwing a tantrum because her reflection didn't validate her. "We just want everyone to feel beautiful today." "Then maybe everyone should act beautiful, too," I muttered, almost too quiet to be heard, but not quite. There was a moment of tension, so thick you could hear the silence crackle. And then Mom sighed, stepped forward, and reached out like she was going to touch my arm. "Emily," she said, lowering her voice, softening her eyes like she always did when she wanted me to fold. "This day is about family, remember?" I stared at her hand, then at her face, and felt this hollow thud in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. I remembered being 8 and giving up the last slice of birthday cake because Rachel cried that hers was smaller. I remembered skipping a school field trip because Rachel had the flu and Mom said she couldn't handle both girls being gone. I remembered Mom telling me, "You're stronger than she is. She needs more from us." And for years, I believed that made me noble. That swallowing my needs made me loved. But on that day, in that silk-draped suite, all it made me feel was small. "I know exactly what this day is about," I said, pulling my arm away before she could reach it. "And for once, it's not about Rachel." I didn't wait for her response. I walked out of the room and down the hallway, heels echoing like punctuation marks on a sentence I'd waited my whole life to write. As I stood outside the bridal suite, hands shaking just enough to make my phone vibrate when I picked it up, I felt the buzz of an incoming text. I looked down, expecting a message from the photographer or the planner, but it was from Tom. "Envelopes ready. Don't tell anyone yet." It was short. Simple. But it carried weight like a secret brick. I stared at the screen, then at the closed door of the dressing room, behind which my mother and sister were probably crafting the narrative of what had just happened. And, for the first time in my life, I didn't care. They could call me dramatic, ungrateful, difficult, hell, they probably already had. Because the envelope wasn't just a surprise. It was a line in the sand. And Rachel, for all her rules and rings and attention-seeking chaos, was about to find out what it felt like when someone took the spotlight and refused to hand it back. If there's a moment when the weight of years finally decides to settle in your bones, mine came dressed in lipstick and pearls, walking calmly into the powder room an hour before the ceremony and offering me a paper towel like we were just 2 women sharing a quiet moment. My mother had always had a gift for pretending the worst things she did were actually acts of love, and that day was no exception. She sat on the velvet bench like she owned the room, crossed her legs like she was modeling for a catalog, and smiled at me like we were about to have a mother-daughter talk that I'd treasure for the rest of my life. "I just wanted a quiet moment," she said, patting her lap as if I were a child, "before everything starts." I should have known something was coming. I should have gotten up, Walked out, told her I needed to use the restroom, and locked myself in a stall until someone knocked politely and told me it was time to walk down the aisle. But I didn't. I sat down across from her, my dress puffing slightly around me, my hands still trembling from Rachel's tantrum earlier, and the text from Tom still burning in my back pocket like a fuse. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a compact, dabbing at her lipstick with the precision of someone who'd spent her entire life making sure her image never cracked. "You're beautiful today," she said finally, eyes still in the mirror. "Just stunning." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Then she did it. She said the thing that would sit in my chest like wet cement for the rest of the day, and maybe for the rest of my life, depending on how long I let it stay there. "We did what we had to do, she said, closing the compact softly. Back then, with the gift cards. Rachel was in crisis. We had no choice. My eyes didn't widen. I didn't gasp. I didn't flinch. I just stared at her, wondering how many times this woman would casually shatter me and call it maternal instinct. "Crisis?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. "You told me it was medical bills." "It was," she said quickly, too quickly. "We thought it might be an autoimmune thing, all those fatigue symptoms, the mood swings, the panic attacks." I let the silence sit between us for a second, maybe two. Then I spoke, slow and careful, like peeling a bandage from skin that hadn't fully healed. "Rachel was just exhausted from partying too hard, Mom. She admitted that to me years ago. She wasn't sick." My mother's face didn't change much, just a flicker of guilt that tried to pass itself off as nostalgia. "She was going through something," she said. "And we were scared. You know how fragile she can be." That was the moment something inside me finally snapped, not in an explosive, throw the chair kind of way, but in the deeply quiet, irreversible kind. The kind where you realize you've been speaking different languages your whole life, and no one's been listening, and the silence wasn't passive, it was chosen. "I needed that money," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "I could have used it for books, rent, maybe a used car to get to my internship. But you gave it to her without even telling me. You stole from me and justified it by calling it love." Mom looked wounded, which almost made me laugh. She sat back slightly, as if I'd slapped her, though all I'd done was tell the truth. "We were trying to keep the family together," she said, as if that explained everything. "It was for all of us. But it wasn't. It never had been." And suddenly I saw it all clearly, how every sacrifice I made had been disguised as virtue, how every selfish thing they did had been painted as noble, and how I had swallowed every injustice with a smile because being angry meant being difficult. And being difficult meant losing what little attention I was allowed. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the compact across the room or demand repayment. I just stood up slowly, brushed off my dress, and looked her in the eye. "Thanks for the talk," I said. "But I think I've got everything I need." Because I did everything I'd never gotten, every tiny betrayal I'd excused, every moment they looked at Rachel like a treasure and me like a backup plan. It was all sitting inside me now like fuel. And I was done pretending it didn't burn. I walked out of the powder room without looking back. I could hear her calling my name softly behind me, like a line from a bedtime story I'd outgrown. But I kept walking, letting the noise die behind me. And as I reached the hallway just outside the main reception room, I saw someone waiting there. My father, Mark. The quiet one. The man who watched every scene play out like a movie he couldn't stop, and always told himself staying neutral was the same as staying peaceful. He looked older than I remembered, hunched slightly, hair grayer, face lined in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with regret. "I hope," he said, voice thick and dry, "that you don't hate us after today." I didn't answer right away. I studied him like I was seeing him for the first time, not as a dad, not as the man who taught me how to ride a bike and fix a leaky faucet, but as a person who let so many things happen under his roof without lifting a hand to stop them. "I don't hate you," I said eventually, But I stopped needing your approval a long time ago. He nodded slowly, like he knew that already but hoped hearing it out loud would change something. It didn't. And as I walked away again, this time toward the dressing room, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child. Not sadness, not rage, but the cold, solid truth of being on my own. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't walking alone anymore. Because the envelope was coming. And it was going to say everything I didn't have to. Tom was never loud, never flashy, and certainly not the kind of man who commanded a room by raising his voice or pounding on tables, but that didn't mean he lacked power. If anything, his strength came from his silence, from the way he listened more than he spoke and remembered the things you didn't even know you were telling him. He had the kind of presence that made people lean in instead of step back. He wasn't interested in showing off, only in showing up, and that made him dangerous in all the best ways. I met Tom at a time in my life when I didn't even know I needed someone like him. I wasn't looking for a man to rescue me, hell. I didn't even think I needed rescuing. I'd already built my survival on silence, on swallowing my pride, on nodding politely while people walked over me like a welcome mat. I didn't know how to ask for help because I never believed I deserved it. But Tom saw through that act from day one, and instead of calling me out on it, he just started building a ladder for me to climb out. He met my family early on, far too early in hindsight, during a rushed holiday dinner I'd foolishly invited him to, thinking maybe it was time they met the man who made me laugh again. We hadn't been together long, but I already felt safer with him than I ever had with anyone. I wanted them to see what I saw, to maybe treat me differently if they realized I was loved by someone who didn't see me as second best. Of course, it didn't go that way. Rachel was, predictably, the star of the evening. She hijacked every conversation, made backhanded comments about how plain girls always get the sweet guys, and went out of her way to talk about her ex-boyfriends in front of Tom, trying to compare stock portfolios and jawlines as if she were reviewing a menu. Susan kept interrupting me, correcting minor details in my stories like I'd misremembered my own life. Mark stayed quiet, chewing his food like it was a chore. Tom watched it all without reacting, just nodding politely, offering small smiles, staying respectful but distant. He didn't say anything that night, but when we got in the car, he turned to me and said, "I don't know what the hell that was, but if you ever want out of that circus, I'll buy the tent and burn it down myself." I laughed not because it was funny, but because no one had ever said anything like that for me before. That dinner changed something for Tom. He realized that my tolerance wasn't a sign of peace, it was a symptom of conditioning. He saw that every time I bit my tongue or looked away or apologized for something I didn't do, it wasn't about manners. It was about survival. So he started making a plan not to fix my family because he knew that was a lost cause, but to protect me from them and to remind me that I didn't have to keep playing a game I never signed up for. It started with small things. When we talked about wedding planning, he offered to handle anything that involved my parents. When we looked at venues, he made sure to ask if I wanted a private room to retreat to. When we talked about the guest list, he asked, without judgment, if there was anyone I didn't want to invite but felt like I had to. And then, about 3 months before the wedding, he brought up the envelope. We were sitting on our back porch, watching the sun dip below the neighbor's fence, when he turned to me and said, "I think we should give them a gift." I laughed, sipping my wine. Like what? An etiquette book and a list of their failures? He shook his head, smiling just enough to let me know he wasn't joking. No. Something they can't ignore. Not cruel, just final. Something that says we're not playing their game anymore. That was the first time he mentioned the property. It turns out, Tom had inherited a small sum of money from a great aunt, and he'd invested it wisely over the years. One of those investments was a lake house, nothing flashy, just a cozy 2-bedroom cabin about 2 hours away. When we first got engaged, he'd floated the idea of turning it into a vacation spot for us, somewhere to escape when life got too loud. But then he'd remembered something Susan had said during that awful dinner, something about always dreaming of a lake house, and how maybe one day one of the girls would buy it for me if they're lucky enough to marry up. Tom never forgot that line. So we agreed we'd prepare a folder. Inside would be a copy of the property deed, transferred into a trust with my name on it. Not for Susan. Not for Rachel. For me. Alongside that, we included a statement showing the funds used, some of which came from a long-forgotten account where my parents had deposited the remainder of the gift money they'd claimed to hold for me years ago. Tom had quietly tracked down those funds. They weren't much, maybe a few thousand, but they were symbolic. It was the same money they'd taken from me under the guise of helping Rachel, repurposed into something I now owned outright. That envelope, he said, isn't revenge. It's just the end of the story. We're writing a better one now. And now, standing at the head table of our wedding reception, with the dance floor buzzing and champagne flutes clinking all around us, I watched Tom reach into his jacket and pull out that envelope. It was thick, sealed with a red wax stamp he'd insisted on ordering from some Etsy shop because, in his words, it adds drama. He placed it gently on the table in front of Susan, who had just finished complaining about the cake being too sweet. Rachel leaned in beside her, smirking like she'd just been told there was gossip inside. Tom didn't say a word. He just smiled. And I didn't blink. There's a particular kind of silence that happens when something shifts and everyone in the room feels it, even if they don't understand it yet, the kind that lands heavy on the air like humidity before a summer storm, thick and full of warning. That silence hit our reception table the second Tom slid that envelope across the white linen cloth, the wax seal catching a glint of chandelier light like something sacred or dangerous or both. For a long moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. The band played on in the background, something soft and jazzy, but at our table, the atmosphere turned dense and still. Susan stared at the envelope like it was a riddle she didn't have the patience to solve. Her fingers hovered above it, then slowly dropped down to touch the wax. She looked up at Tom, confusion laced through her carefully plucked brows. "What's this supposed to be?" she asked, voice light but strained. Tom didn't answer right away. He just smiled, not cruelly, but with the confidence of a man who knew he was about to say something unforgettable. "Just a little something for the two of you," he said, gesturing toward both Susan and Mark, who had been silently sipping his bourbon and pretending not to notice the tension unfolding right beside him. Rachel leaned over Susan's shoulder like a dog sniffing a steak. "Is it cash?" she asked, half joking, but clearly hopeful. Tom stayed quiet. Susan, never one to tolerate mystery unless she was the one creating it, broke the seal and opened the envelope. Inside, she found a neatly arranged folder with 3 documents. The first was a copy of a wire transfer from Tom's investment account. The second was a notarized contract for the purchase of a lakefront property located in a county that had come up dozens of times over the years in conversations where Susan waxed poetic about someday owning a peaceful little getaway. The third document was the kicker, a transfer of ownership placing the home, and all assets attached to it, into a trust. Not in Susan's name. Not even in both mine and Tom's. Just mine. Emily Jordan Grant. Sole beneficiary, sole trustee, sole owner. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages, her lips tightening with each line she read. Mark, now leaning closer, took the documents and started scanning them himself, the color draining slowly from his already pale face. Rachel, still oblivious, grabbed the page with the address and read it aloud. "Wait, is this the place off Route 17? With a wraparound porch and private dock?" "Mom's been obsessed with that place since, like, forever." Tom nodded. "We know. That's why we bought it." Rachel blinked. "Wait, you're giving it to Mom, right?" That's when I spoke for the first time. "No, Rachel. It's mine." The words hung there like smoke, curling around the stunned expressions that had started to form at the table. Susan laughed, not a joyful laugh, but the kind that people make when they've walked straight into a wall and are trying to pretend it was part of the plan. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling now. Why would you put it in your name? Tom answered this time, his voice calm, steady, unshakable. Because Emily deserves something that isn't taken from her. Because for once, she deserves to come first. Susan's eyes narrowed, the warmth draining from her expression like wine soaking into white carpet. Is this about the gift cards again? She said, practically hissing. You're still angry about that? That was years ago. We did what we had to do for the family. I felt something deep inside me, not a flare of rage, not even satisfaction, but something stronger. Something clean and cold and absolute. You took money meant for me, and you gave it to Rachel, I said, voice low and firm. You made excuses and called it love. But this isn't an excuse. It's a boundary. Rachel suddenly looked less smug. You can't do this, she said, her voice rising in pitch. You can't just decide something like that without including the family. That place should be for all of us. You know, Mom always dreamed of that house. Tom leaned in then, his hand resting casually on the edge of the table, and he said the words that dropped like a steel door slamming shut. We already did. The look on Rachel's face was priceless, not just disbelief, but actual confusion, like she genuinely couldn't comprehend a world in which she wasn't automatically included in every prize. Susan, still holding the documents, looked at me like I'd just slapped her in front of a crowd. Maybe in a way I had. But what none of them realized was that this wasn't revenge. This wasn't a punishment. It was a declaration. I wasn't going to keep living my life asking for scraps at a table that I had helped set but had never been allowed to sit at. I had stopped waiting for an invitation to be seen. I had made something mine not out of spite, but out of necessity. For the first time, I had drawn a clear line between what I would tolerate and what I wouldn't. Mark didn't say anything, just stared at the pages like he was reading a confession he already knew by heart, but had never had the courage to speak out loud. Tom reached for my hand under the table, gave it a squeeze, and really looked at me, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly who he was doing it for. Around us, the clinking of forks and clatter of champagne glasses faded into a low hum, the world narrowing to the stunned silence of three people who had spent my entire life pretending they held all the cards. And now, for the first time, they realized I had a few of my own. The envelope lay open in front of them, its contents no longer a mystery, but a message. Not everything is yours just because you're used to getting it. And I'm not yours just because I've always said yes. By the time Tom stood up to give his toast, the air in the reception hall had shifted in a way only the truly observant would notice, not in volume or music or lights, but in the subtle undercurrent of glances exchanged, of people suddenly sitting up straighter, sensing a moment was about to arrive without knowing why. The kind of stillness that lives just beneath a storm, where nobody says anything but everybody feels everything. Tom took his time rising, smoothing his jacket, lifting his glass without the slightest hint of tension, like this was just another speech at just another wedding. But I knew better. I knew what was coming, even if I didn't know the words he was about to choose. He cleared his throat gently, smiled toward me, and then turned to the sea of faces gathered in the golden glow of string lights and flickering votives, raising his glass slowly, like a man offering not just a drink, but something sacred. First off, he began, voice warm and steady, thank you all for being here tonight. It means more to us than I can say, to be surrounded by people who've watched us grow, stumble, and somehow end up in each other's arms anyway. The crowd chuckled, a ripple of polite amusement moving through the tables, glasses already halfway lifted, people ready for a standard, sweet little tribute to the bride, maybe a few jokes, something light. Tom didn't give them that. He continued, his smile not fading but sharpening just slightly at the edges. I've always believed that weddings reveal a lot, not just about love, but about truth. About the choices we make when no one's watching, and the way we treat people who can't do anything for us. Those little decisions, they're the real vows, long before any rings are exchanged. There it was, the shift. Heads tilted. Eyes narrowed just slightly. I saw my cousin Olivia lower her wine glass an inch. Even the photographer paused behind her camera, sensing that whatever this was, it deserved more than a snapshot. Tom pressed on, weaving his words like thread through a needle, delicate and precise. Love isn't just about saying the right things at the right moments. It's about how you show up when things are uncomfortable, when being kind costs you something, when nobody is applauding. And family, he said, his voice dipping ever so slightly, family should never be about hierarchy or conditions or who screams the loudest. It should be about who shows up and stays. I watched Susan's face carefully, the corners of her smile twitching as if they couldn't decide whether to hold or fall. Rachel, beside her, crossed her arms, her mouth a thin line of practiced disinterest. Mark sat still, looking down into his scotch, as if studying the reflection of a younger man. Tom turned his attention back to me now, and when he did, everything in the room softened, not because the tension had broken, but because he was about to twist the knife so gently they wouldn't even know they were bleeding yet. When I met Emily, she didn't talk much about her family. Not at first. She always redirected, always made excuses, always smiled a little too hard when someone asked her about her childhood. And for a long time, I let it slide because I thought maybe she was just private. He paused, letting the silence stretch long enough for the weight of his words to land. But then I realized something, he said, turning now to face the crowd directly. She wasn't being private. She was protecting people who never protected her. There was a flicker, maybe a breath, maybe a whisper, and suddenly every fork froze midair. People glanced at each other, unsure whether they were hearing what they thought they were hearing. She made peace where she should have made boundaries, he continued, now speaking not like a groom, but like a man who had waited years to say these words. She gave grace where she should have demanded accountability. And for a long time, she was told that being quiet made her strong. But let me tell you something, Emily doesn't need to be quiet to be strong. A murmur passed through the room. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't silence either. A few eyes turned toward Susan, who sat so still she could have been carved from stone. Tom lifted his glass higher now, voice still calm, still low, but unmistakably surgical. So today, I want to thank the people who actually showed up for Emily, not just in body, but in spirit. The ones who saw her clearly, who valued her without asking her to shrink, who loved her without making her earn it. He looked directly at my best friend Alyssa, then at my Aunt Carol, then at my college roommate Jessa, who'd flown in from Oregon on a standby ticket and hadn't stopped hugging me since. And to everyone else, he said, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, don't worry. We've already sent the thank you cards. It landed like thunder. Subtle, but undeniable. A ripple of understanding rolled through the guests, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding slowly. Some just stared at their plates like the truth was written in the crumbs. Susan stood up. Her chair scraped back hard against the floor, the sound sharp and sudden. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her face said everything: confusion, betrayal, fury, like a woman watching her favorite mirror shatter and realizing she was never the fairest one to begin with. Rachel followed, less gracefully, knocking over her wine glass in the process. She barked something under her breath, a swear or maybe a warning, and stormed after Susan, heels tapping like gunshots across the hardwood. But Mark, he stayed. He sat back in his chair, glass still in hand, and did something I never expected. He clapped. Slow, deliberate, not smiling. Just clapping. Like a man who had finally seen the play from the right angle and realized he'd spent years applauding the wrong actor. Tom sat down beside me again, slid his arm behind my back, and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "You can breathe now." And for the first time all day, I did. But even then, I knew it wasn't over. Not really. Not yet. There was something surreal about the way the fairy lights draped across the oak beams overhead flickered just softly enough to feel like stars, the kind you only see in small towns or childhood memories, flickers of peace scattered through the chaos. The DJ had turned the volume down to a low, almost reverent hum, the kind of song you don't really dance to so much as exist within. Tom and I moved slowly across the dance floor, hands folded together, his thumb brushing small, rhythmic circles across the back of my palm, as if he could smooth out the last of the day's tension by touch alone. People around us were mostly quiet now, the evening winding down, desserts half-eaten, bouquets a little wilted, children asleep under jackets in corners of the room. The drama had passed like a storm, leaving broken branches and oddly clearer skies. No one was talking about the toast anymore, not openly, but you could feel it in the way they looked at me, with caution, with curiosity, with questions they didn't quite have the nerve to ask out loud. But I wasn't thinking about them. Not anymore. I was thinking about what it meant to finally stand in my own story instead of being written into someone else's. I was thinking about all the years I'd spent twisting myself into smaller and quieter versions just to keep the peace, about the number of holidays I'd smiled through clenched teeth, about how many times I'd said it's okay when it absolutely wasn't. And yet, in that moment, none of it felt heavy. Because Tom had given me a different kind of silence, not the one I grew up in, filled with avoidance and unspoken resentment, but a silence made of safety, of choice. A silence that said, "You can rest now." As we swayed under the lights, his forehead gently brushed mine, and I closed my eyes for a second longer than I meant to, letting the hum of the music and the warmth of his body remind me that I had finally, somehow, ended up exactly where I needed to be. Then I felt a shift in the room again, not loud, not jarring, but unmistakable. I opened my eyes and saw him standing at the edge of the dance floor, hands clasped awkwardly in front of him like he didn't know what to do with them, eyes slightly askew, eyes tired in that way guilt makes them. Mark. My father. I hadn't seen him since Susan and Rachel had stormed out of the reception hall over an hour ago, their exit marked not by words, but by the absence they left behind, like someone had unplugged a television mid-scene. He hadn't followed them. He'd stayed in his chair, then wandered somewhere, and now he was here, standing a few feet away from me, waiting for something. I let go of Tom's hand slowly and stepped toward him, not entirely sure why. Maybe part of me still hoped there was something left in him I could trust, or maybe I just needed to hear whatever it was he'd finally worked up the nerve to say. He looked at me, really looked, for what might have been the first time in years. "I should have said something sooner," he said, voice raw, not rehearsed. "Not today. I mean, years ago." I waited, arms crossed, not defensive, not open, just still. He cleared his throat. "I didn't agree with what your mom did. Or Rachel. But I told myself staying out of it was better than starting fights. I thought that made me neutral, peacekeeper even." I said nothing. He went on. "But I wasn't neutral, was I? I let it happen. I let them walk all over you, and I stood there like a damn piece of furniture. I watched him, this man who used to lift me onto his shoulders and teach me how to tie knots in the backyard, now unraveling in front of me, not falling apart, exactly, but finally facing what he'd been pretending wasn't there. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said. "Not for the money. Not for the wedding. For being quiet when you needed me to be loud." I nodded once, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. I had waited a long time to hear those words, and now that they were here, they didn't fix anything. But they mattered anyway. Still, I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and walked back to Tom, who had never once been quiet when I needed him to speak, who had always seen me not as a supporting character in someone else's life, but as a whole damn story worth telling. I slipped my hand into his, leaned against his shoulder, and watched my father's reflection fade in the mirrored dance floor as he walked back into the crowd. I didn't hate him, but I didn't follow him either. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can say is nothing at all. The final song of the night played as we danced again, not a fairy tale melody, not some sweeping orchestral piece, but a soft, simple tune with lyrics about finding home in another person. And as we moved, I looked around the room, at the people who stayed, who laughed and clapped and cried and held space without demanding anything in return. And I smiled, a real one this time. Not the one I used to paste on to keep the mood light. Not the one I wore to convince myself things were fine when they weren't. But the kind that rises up from someplace deeper, the kind that says, yes, I made it. And no one gets to take that from me now. The lights dimmed, the music faded, the last glasses clinked, and still I stood in that glow. And I know what some of you are thinking. I know some of you think I went too far, that I should have taken the high road, that I should have hugged Susan at the end, or let Rachel stay and pretend like none of it ever happened. I know some of you believe forgiveness is the goal, no matter the wound. But here's the thing. When your whole life has been spent in second place, always cheering for people who never once clapped for you, eventually you start to wonder what winning even looks like. And sometimes, just sometimes, it looks like walking away. Without apology. Without explanation. And never looking back.